Welcome to CWJah Talk number 39. Pre-Christian evidence. Jesus is the biblical Messiah. A look at Psalm 2, verses 2 through 9. And a Dead Sea Scroll known as 4Q246, the Son of God Scroll, dated to around the mid to early 1st century BCE, so about 50 to 75 years before Jesus was born. The book of Psalms goes back, of course, much further to the time of King David, and we have textual evidence for the Dead Sea Scrolls, including parts of the text we're going to read tonight from the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as in the Masoretic tradition that is accepted by the Jews who reject Jesus as the biblical Messiah. So the texts we're going to be considering, as they are translated and read today, are really not in dispute that they date to a time before Jesus was even born, before there were anyone known as a Christian. There are some translation issues with the document 4Q246 we're going to review, but for the most part, I think you'll see that they fit with ideas that are expressed not only in Psalm 2, but in other biblical books like Daniel. And the reason I'm going to bring in Daniel tonight in relation to our discussion of Psalm 2 is because the text from Daniel I'm going to bring in to our discussion tie in with 4Q246 and Psalm 2. And the texts in Daniel I'm going to discuss, even though they're pre-Christian, they have fulfillment for the most part later. They're not texts, the ones we're going to read from Daniel chapter 7, that are fulfilled explicitly in things Jesus did while he was on earth. They talk more so about things that he is supposed to do, in our view, later. So they don't quite fit in with the pre-Christian evidence series, the text from Daniel 7 we're going to review. But the text from Psalm do. Psalm 2, and parts of 4Q246. Before we get to Psalm 2, because there's some dispute over who's being talked about there, at least in a messianic sense, let's take a look at a couple other texts that we've reviewed before as part of this series. And in regards to the first text we're going to review for sure, that is Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. Let's take a look at it together. And then the next text we're going to look at is in Isaiah 11, which is going to be a text we're going to discuss in more detail 2 Sundays from now. But I want to discuss Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, and Isaiah 11, 1 through 12, before we go to Psalm 2. Because I think it will help us understand who's being talked about there better. And the book of Isaiah is probably the best represented book in the entire Bible. It has at least one complete copy represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls and a good portion of a second copy, as well as other fragments and texts that date back to the 1st century or earlier, and then, of course, the entire Masoretic tradition, as well as various translations like the Greek Septuagint. So the book of Isaiah is very credible from a textual standpoint. And there is evidence that shows that Isaiah was also a real historical person, even outside of the Bible. So looking at the book of Isaiah will give us some credible insight into how things were understood by the Jewish people before Jesus arrived. Isaiah 9, 6 and 7. It says, "For there has been a child born to us. There has been a son given to us. And the princely rule will come to be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. Verse 7, to the abundance of the princely rule and to peace there will be no end. Upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, in order to establish it firmly and to sustain it by means of justice and by means of righteousness from now on and to time indefinite, the very zeal of Jehovah of armies will do this. So we've talked about this text as part of this series on the pre-Christian evidence that Jesus is the biblical Messiah. And there are several things in these two texts in particular that uniquely apply to Jesus, right? And not really to Israel as a nation. Many Jews who reject Jesus as the biblical Messiah look to the nation of Israel as the fulfillment of some of these messianic texts. So they would see, for example, certain things like even a child being born or a son, because Israel is called God's son in the Bible. And we talked about this in my discussion of Colossians 1:15 through 17, the Bible and the Trinity in Conflict, part 17. How there are terms in the Bible like son and firstborn, both of which Israel is called in a figurative sense, but not literally. Nevertheless, many Jews will say it's being used in a figurative sense for Israel, or sometimes for the house of David, not an individual. But when you look at this text, so in addition to a child being born, right? The child is being born to us. Who's us? Well, us is Israel, the Israelites. So how could it be Israel? Like Israel is at times called God's son or his firstborn. Here, it's not calling Israel God's son. It's saying there's a son born to us, to Israel. There's been a son given to us, Israel. And then it refers to the son, the child, by a singular pronoun, his, and then it gives him several titles, including mighty God, El Gibor. That's not a term that's given to a nation ever. And in the Greek Septuagint translation, as is often done, like I talked about in CWJah Talk 38, the gods of Psalm 82, in the Septuagint of Isaiah 9:6, it translates this as angel of great counsel. It calls the one born here, the son given to us, an angel. And yet many Trinitarians reject Jesus as Michael the archangel or as any kind of angel, in spite of the fact that this text in the Greek translation renders El as angel, just like it does numerous times in the Psalms when referring to angels as gods. For example, Psalm 8:5, quoted in Hebrews 2:7 and 9 in the New Testament, translating Elohim as angels. And there are numerous other examples, as I discussed in CWJah Talk 38. So there's more going on here than is really applicable to a nation referred to figuratively as a child or as a son, let alone a mighty God or angel of great counsel. So it then goes on to describe the rulership and the throne of David that rulership would be based upon, and David's kingdom. So it specifically links the princely rule to the throne of David, an individual. Now let's take a look at Isaiah 11, 1 through 12. And this is right before we go to Psalm 2, because as you'll see, and as many Jews believe, there's an issue with who's being talked about in Psalm 2, whether it's an individual, whether it's anyone else than David, or whether it's Israel or the house of David. Well, again, as we're seeing already, just in these two texts from Isaiah 9, 6 and 7, there's a son born to us, to Israel. So it really can't be Israel. It wouldn't make any sense. And then the reference to the child born to Israel as a mighty God, an angel of great counsel. These are terms that always are referred to individuals, not nations. Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 12. There must go forth a twig out of the stump of Jesse. Jesse is King David's father. And here, right after what we read in Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, about the child born to us, a son given to us, mighty God, angel of great counsel, it says there's a twig, right? A little twig out of the stump of Jesse. So Jesse is an individual member of Israel, the nation of Israel, right? David's father. So this twig couldn't be Israel, right? How could it be? Israel already exists. Jesse's a member of Israel, an individual, and the twig comes out of Jesse. And it says, out of his roots, out of Jesse's roots, out of David's father's roots, a sprout will be fruitful. And then it goes on to say, and upon him, this twig out of this individual who is David's father, upon him, the Spirit of Jehovah must settle down. The Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of mightiness, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of Jehovah. And there will be enjoyment by him out of this twig. There will be enjoyment by this twig out of this individual named Jesse, who's David's father. David, the one on whose throne the child that's born to us would have a princely rule that's firmly established, and he'd be called Mighty God, Angel of Great Counsel. Jesus is called a God in the New Testament. He's said to have the voice of the archangel, 1 Thessalonians 4. I talked about those things in my CWJah talk on Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, but I'm pointing them out here just to keep you kind of in the thought, in the frame of understanding that these texts present to us. There's really nothing here so far that recommends the view of a figurative use of son or child or mighty God, angel of great counsel. Everything points to it being an individual out of Israel, out of Jesse, born to Israel, born to us. There will be enjoyment by this twig out of Jesse in the fear of Jehovah. He will not judge by any mere appearance to his eyes, nor reprove, simply according to the thing heard by his ears. And with righteousness he must judge the lowly ones, and with uprightness he must give reproof in behalf of the meek ones of the earth. And he must strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the spirit of his lips he will put the wicked one to death. And righteousness must prove to be the belt of his hips, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. All descriptions that appear again consistent with an individual, singular pronoun. Yes, you can have figurative references like Israel's called God's son, his firstborn. But that doesn't appear to fit from Isaiah 9:6 to this point. And then it goes on to say that the result of that, right? The result of these things happening, this twig coming out of Jesse, the Spirit of Jehovah settling down upon him, him striking the earth with the rod of his mouth, putting the wicked one to death. The result of that is the wolf will reside for a while with the male lamb, and with the kid, the leopard itself will lie down, and the calf, and the maned young lion and the well-fed animal all together, and a mere little boy will be leader over them. Things that haven't happened yet, right? Things that no one has experienced in the ways that they are describing, right? And the cow and the bear themselves will feed. Together the young ones will lie down, and even the lion will eat straw just like the bull. So there's this birth, right? There's this twig. There's, as we read in Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, there's this child, this son, this mighty God who has a princely rule upon the throne of David, who is called a twig out of David's father, Jesse, on whom the spirit of Jehovah or Jehovah settles down. And then he brings about peace to the earth by destroying the wicked, judging the lowly with uprightness, creates these conditions no one has seen. And then it talks about the child playing upon the hole of a cobra, upon the light aperture of a snake. The child will put his own hand. They will not do any harm, nor cause any ruin in all my holy mountain, because the earth will certainly be filled with the knowledge of Jehovah as the waters are covering the very sea. And it must occur in that day that there will be the root of Jesse that will be standing up as a signal for the peoples. Okay, so that the root, the twig, the child, the son, the mighty God, angel of great counsel, that one will stand up. Sorry about that. I kind of displaced us there. There we go. Will stand up as a signal for the peoples, and to him even the nations. Okay, now we're even outside of Israel. The child is born to us. The son is given to us. It's out of the root of Jesse, a twig from Jesse, David's father. And this princely rule would come to be upon David's throne. And that root of Jesse will stand up as a signal, and all the nations will turn inquiringly, and his resting place will become glorious. And it must occur in that day that Jehovah will again offer his hand a second time to acquire the remnant of his people who will remain over from Assyria and from Egypt, from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. He will certainly raise up a signal for the nations and gather the dispersed ones of Israel, and the scattered ones of Judah he will collect together from the four extremities of the earth. When you read this account, right, there's so much here that's talked about in the New Testament. It's striking. In particular, when you read things like how the one who is from the root of Jesse, on whom the princely rule falls, through the line of David, on David's throne, the nations turn inquiringly to him, and he has a resting place. And we're going to talk about that resting place in CWJah Talk number 40 next Sunday when we discuss Psalm 16:10, which we'll read in a moment. But it talks about this one having a resting place, becoming glorious, which in our view as Christians we believe was Jesus being put to death and being raised up in glory. His resting place became glorious. And then we believe after Jesus was born from Jesse as a twig, and that he lived as a man and the spirit of Jehovah settled down upon him, he will eventually provide conditions that will lead to the end of the wicked one something Jesus didn't do while alive, but that he will do, that will lead to these kinds of conditions. But that prior to this, he would stand up as a signal for the peoples, and the nations would turn inquiringly. Right? It's just as you see today, and since the time of Jesus, all the nations have turned in some sense, more or less, not everyone, but many from all these nations, to Jesus, right? It's not just the nation of Israel following their own laws and having alien residents and looking to Moses. It's everybody now, outside of Israel even, and not even necessarily always Israel or Israelites, looking to Jesus inquiringly, right? Doesn't mean accepting him. Inquiringly, questioning, wondering about him. Who is this person? What's happening? Kind of like what we're talking about tonight, right? We're people of the nations who have turned inquiringly, in a more positive sense than many people. But it says that he would stand up as a signal for nations to look to and then inquire about him. He would have a resting place that becomes glorious. And then Jehovah would offer his hand a second time, which we believe is happening right now, since his resurrection, since his resting place became glorious. In CWJah Talk 41, I'm going to talk a lot more about Isaiah chapter 11, these texts we just read. But I'm emphasizing some of it right now. Because when we get to Psalm 2, it's important that we understand this issue of whether the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who's spoken about in some of these texts like Psalm 2, is a person, is a house, or is a nation. And as you can see, when it's talking about people like Jesse, David's father, and the things that would come forth from him, and the things that would be established upon David and his throne, his kingdom. When we get to Psalm 2, this is going to help make a lot of sense of that in terms of how these things were understood by the Jews at this time. So I think it's pretty clear, though, in reading these two sections of Isaiah, that the child born, the son that's born to Israel, to us, isn't Israel. It's born out of an individual's line, Jesse and David ultimately, who are members of Israel, who are part of the us. It's not the us. It's the child of us, the mighty God child, the angel of great counsel child, the one to whom the nations would look inquiringly child, and who would have a resting place child, and whose resting place became glorious child, after which God would offer his hand again and raise up as a signal for the nations and gather the dispersed ones of Israel. We believe that's happening right now. The scattered ones of Judah from the four extremities of the earth. Now, before we get to Psalm 2, just to make this very clear in terms of what this throne of David represents, right? Who is spoken of as sitting on that, right? Let's just do a search. Let's go ahead and search throne of David. Here you can see it comes up in Jeremiah 17:25. There will also certainly enter in by the gates of the city kings with princes, sitting on the throne of David. Right? Individuals. Kings with princes sitting on the throne of David, riding in the chariot upon horses. It's not a nation. Jeremiah 22:2, and you must say, hear the word of Jehovah, O King of Judah, who are sitting on the throne of David, you with your servants and your people, those who are coming in through the gates. Hear the word of Jehovah, O King of Judah, who are sitting on the throne of David, an individual. Jeremiah 22:30. This is what Jehovah has said. Write down this man as childless, as an able-bodied man who will not have any success in his days. For from his offspring not a single one will have any success, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling anymore in Judah. That's an individual. That's not a nation. It's not even a house. It's an individual. Write down this man as childless, as an able-bodied man. From his offspring, for from his offspring not a single one will have any success. Not a single one of his offspring, not the collective offspring, not an individual sitting on David's throne in this text, in its reference, will have any success. Jeremiah 29:16, for this is what Jehovah has said to the king sitting upon the throne of David and to all the people dwelling in the city. Very clear, is it not? There's an individual king sitting on the throne of David, differentiated from all the people. Jeremiah 36:30, therefore this is what Jehovah has said against Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. He will come to have no one sitting upon the throne of David. No one. That's an individual. I'm sorry, my transliteration of Jehoiakim or Jehoiachim, this is, it's got 2 question marks, so I may be mispronouncing the name there. I apologize. My transliteration of the NWT in this case has a few instances where question marks obscure the pronunciation. Either way, that's not the point here. The point is, he will have no one sitting upon the throne of David. The king of Judah will have no one sitting upon the throne of David, an individual. Once again. And then in Luke 1:32, a text we'll get to again a little bit later. This one will be great and will be called Son of the Most High. And God will give him the throne of David, his father, referring to Jesus. Now let's go to Psalm 2, the text that's the basis for our discussion this evening. With this understanding in mind, this understanding of the twig from Jesse, the child born to us, the son given to us, the mighty God, the angel of great counsel, the one who would stand up as a signal for all the nations, whose resting place would be glorious, upon whom the Spirit of Jehovah would settle down. Let's take this understanding, the one whose princely rule as a twig of Jesse would come to be established upon the throne of David. And every time the throne of David is referred to in the Bible, as we just read, it's referring to an individual sitting on that throne. Psalm 2, verses 2 through 9. The kings of the earth take their stand, and high officials themselves have massed together as one against Jehovah and against his anointed one, or Messiah, Christ, saying, let us tear their bands apart and cast their cords away from us. The very one sitting in the heavens will laugh. Jehovah himself will hold them in derision. At that time he will speak to them in his anger, and in his hot displeasure he will disturb them, saying, I, even I, have installed my king upon Mount Zion, my holy mountain, my king. Let me refer to the decree of Jehovah. He has said to me, you are my son. So David is the one historically accepted as writing this psalm, and which is why many people accept this as being applied initially to David, because he says he's referring to the decree of Jehovah, who said to me, right? An individual, David, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me that I may give nations as your inheritance and the ends of the earth as your own possession. You will break them with an iron scepter, as though a potter's vessel. You will dash them to pieces. Okay, so how do we know this doesn't just apply to David? It appears very clear. This is an individual application, does it not? It says right here, in addition to my king, right? I mean, is Israel ever called a king? I'm not aware of that. It is called figuratively God's son and firstborn. But we just showed in Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 that the child that is to be born and that is to have a rule on the throne of David, the one we're talking about right here in this psalm, is not Israel. It's a child born to Israel, a twig out of Jesse, David's father, who's called a mighty God or angel of great counsel. So there's not the same type of contextual indicators that would suggest it's Israel in Isaiah 9 or Isaiah 11 or in Psalm 2, because the writer, the psalmist, David, is referring to the decree of Jehovah to him. Because it says, he said to me, you are my son. So it's not talking about Israel here. He's talking directly to David and saying in his decree to David, you, David, you are my son. And David is saying, the God of Israel said to me, you are my son, my king, my anointed one. So doesn't this just all refer to David then? It doesn't appear to be the case. Remember, in Isaiah 11, we read how the one who is a twig out of David's father has a resting place that is glorious, and then is stood up as a signal for all the nations and the scattered Israelites and Judah. So let's take a look at how this text is applied in the New Testament to see if all of this just applies to David. Because David goes on from writing this, the decree of Jehovah said to me, you are my son, I today have become your father. In Psalm 16:10, which we'll review next weekend in detail, David writes, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol. You will not allow your loyal one to see the pit. And yet David did see the pit. His soul did remain in Sheol. He wasn't brought out of it. But according to the New Testament, there was someone who was brought out of it, who didn't see corruption or the pit. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 13 and look at the reasoning that's given in the New Testament for Psalm 2 and its description of the king as being God's son, together with what we just read in Psalm 16:10 about not allowing your loyal one, the same one who wrote Psalm 2, right, in Psalm 16, these different things, some of which don't appear to be applicable to David in the sense of his soul remaining in Sheol and seeing the pit. In the book of Acts chapter 13, look at how they reason on this. Starting in verse 32, it says, these are the Christians who are now speaking to people that they come across, inhabitants of Jerusalem and other people, as part of proclaiming the good news about Jesus. It says, so we are declaring to you the good news about the promise made to the forefathers, that God has entirely fulfilled it to us, their children, and that he resurrected Jesus, even as it is written in the second Psalm. You are my son, I have become your father this day. And that fact that he resurrected him from the dead, destined no more to return to corruption, he has stated in this way, I will give you people, the loving kindness to David that are faithful. Hence he also says in another psalm, you will not allow your loyal one to see corruption, or the pit. And then it says, for David on the one hand served the express will of God in his own generation, and fell asleep in death, and was laid with his fathers, and did see corruption. He did see the pit. On the other hand, he whom God raised up did not see corruption. Right, now not everyone believes that. We understand that as Christians. But the point here is, there are things in the Psalms that David writes that don't apply to David, because things happen to David that he says wouldn't happen to him. You will not allow your loyal one to see the pit, to remain in Sheol. So this is why at times we look at texts from the Old Testament as having another fulfillment. That's why at times in the New Testament, Christians apply texts like Psalm 2, you are my son, I today have become your father, to Jesus and not to David in its ultimate fulfillment, because of the way David writes about things in ways that didn't have a fulfillment in him. So the text from Psalm 2 is used in the New Testament to refer to the resurrection, whereas in the psalm itself it's referring to David being installed as the king of God's people. So it does have an initial application, and we do believe even Psalm 16:10 will apply to David when he's resurrected. And so in the ultimate sense, like Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 15, that which is corruptible puts on incorruption, and death is swallowed up forever. So ultimately, eventually, we believe Psalm 16:10 will even apply to David, to all who have been put to death, but who are going to be given life, an incorruptible life in the future. But in a more immediate sense, in the context of the other prophecies related to both David and Jesse his father and the child. Right? So Psalm 2 isn't just written in isolation from these other texts that were believed by the Jews to have fulfillment in a future figure. Right? The throne of David is directly tied to the Messiah in Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 11. And there it refers to the resting place of that one. It refers to the rule of that one, right? The rule that comes on the throne of David in this child that's born to us. So it's not the us, it's not Israel, it's a child born to Israel through Jesse, David, established on the throne of David, that we believe in Psalm 2 has this fulfillment because of the resting place spoken of in Isaiah 11 about this twig from Jesse, David's father, in the context of the rule that would be established on the throne of David, Jesse's son, and that David speaks about in terms of not seeing the pit or remaining in Sheol. And so this resting place of Isaiah 11 that then becomes glorious, that seems to tie in with one who is killed, but in a way unlike anybody else, right? In a glorious way, and where you're not left in Sheol. You're not allowed to see the pit or corruption in the fullest sense in which everybody else is seeing it. And so when we read about the throne of David, when we read about this anointed one, and his throne right here, his kingship being established, that David as this king who is called God's son will eventually be given nations and the ends of the earth as his possession. What did we read in Isaiah 11 about the one whose resting place would become glorious, that he would be stood up as a signal for all the nations and for Israel, to the four extremities of the earth. Right? So that didn't happen with David. It didn't happen even with David's house. It did happen with a member of David's house, a twig, Jesus. Because look at how all the nations turn to him inquiringly. Nobody is turning to the house of David inquiringly. Maybe some Israelites or Jews, but that it says all the nations would turn to him inquiringly. It says right here in Psalm 2 that as David is installed as king and called God's son, the nations are given as his inheritance and the ends of the earth as his possession. That didn't happen to David. It says that would happen to the twig from Jesse, through the root of Jesse, on the throne of David, and the one who would be given a glorious resting place and then stood up as a signal so that all these nations would look to him, including the nation of Israel and Judah, from the four extremities of the earth. And that one was clearly distinguished by birth from Israel, the us, in Isaiah 9:6, the mighty God, the angel of great counsel, not us or Israel or David's house. It's established through David's line on David's throne, just like Isaiah 9:6 and 7 say. So there are things both in Psalm 2 through 9 and Psalm 16:10, which we'll get to more next week, that David talks about with respect to himself that didn't happen with David. But that when you look at in the light of Isaiah 9:6 and 7, and the throne of David, the twig of Jesse, and the resting place that's glorious, and the one whose resting place that is, who's then stood up as a signal for all the nations and Israel, that fits. That fits with Psalm 16:10, and it fits with Psalm 2 through 9. Let's take a look further at how this is applied in the New Testament, because you notice here, it says, you will break them with an iron scepter, and as a potter's vessel, you will dash them to pieces. So let's take a look now in the New Testament. Revelation chapter 2. Notice how this is applied. And then we're going to go to Daniel before we get to 4Q 246. In Revelation 2, look at how this is described. Right? So we have in the book of Acts, chapter 13, the Christians applying Psalm 2, and the part from Psalm 2 that says, you are my son, I today have become your father, to the resurrection of Jesus, which ties in not only with Psalm 16:10, the writer of Psalm 2 and Psalm 16:10 being David, but also with Isaiah 11 and the resting place that is glorious. You have the Christian writers applying that to Jesus because David did see the pit, did remain in Sheol, and he isn't stood up as a signal for all the nations to look to inquiringly in association with his glorious resting place. Those two things don't apply to David. The nations all looking to him inquiringly and him not seeing the pit and having a glorious resting place after which he stood up as a signal. Those things find unique fulfillment in the things that are said to have been done by Jesus. Now, you can reject all those things that are written about Jesus. But again, as I've said before, that there are a lot of things that are either really coincidences, made up in a way that's just incredibly difficult to accept from this much historical literature over this long a period of time, written by people like David in ways where he's speaking about things that don't fully apply to him, where he says Jehovah's talking to him, giving him a decree, and then he writes things about himself that even he didn't believe or didn't come to fulfillment in him, right? That he would not see the pit, that he would be one to whom all the nations, the four extremities of the earth would look to. But he did see himself in that sense fulfilling those texts because of the Messiah, because of the promises that were made according to the house and the throne of David. How much David actually understood and saw, we can't really say. But what we can say is what he wrote down as being fulfilled in him was not fulfilled in him, and other texts that were believed by people who were associated with David or part of the nation of Israel, Isaiah, speak directly about the fulfillment of those very same things, not seeing the pit or corruption, not remaining in Sheol, having all the nations as your inheritance or being looked to inquiringly. Those things are written about with respect to the twig out of the line of David from Jesse's father and on the throne of David. The one would establish these things, or these things would come to fulfillment, both in the past and then in the future, with all the descriptions of things that haven't happened yet about the peaceful conditions on earth when the wicked are no more, right? But we also read about other periods of time, namely the resting place being glorious, being stood up as a signal for all the nations, and then the second chance that Jehovah gives all the nations and Israel and Judah. So there's a continuation of things that happen beyond David, that David and others who wrote about David speak as being fulfilled in reference to the line of David, or the Messiah, the twig from Jesse. The child, the son born to us, Israel. Look at Revelation 2, New Testament book, where Jesus is said to be talking after he's been resurrected from his resting place in glory. He says, to him that conquers and observes my deeds down to the end, I will give authority over nations, and he shall shepherd the people with an iron rod, so that they will be broken to pieces like clay vessels, just like Psalm 2 spoke about with regard to David, that he would dash the nations to pieces like a potter dashes clay vessels. The same as I received from my Father. Okay, so you might say, as a Jew, well, Psalm 2 doesn't talk about all these other people being the ones with the iron rod and breaking, shepherding the iron rods so that they're broken to pieces like clay vessels. Psalm 2 specifically said that of David, right here, that you will break them with an iron scepter, as though a potter's vessel, you will dash them to pieces. So why does the New Testament then start to apply this in a sense that now refers to more individuals? Let's go to Daniel. Daniel chapter 7. It's not just a New Testament concept that there would be this child born to us, this son given to us, who would be a mighty God, an angel of great counsel, who would have a rulership on David's throne, a glorious resting place, who would be stood up as a signal for the nations, for Israel and for Judah, and then break the nations to pieces like clay vessels. It's not just one individual. It is an individual. We just read it, right? It was pretty clear. It was David initially, and then David even writes about things that don't have fulfillment in him, but that others like Isaiah write about as being fulfilled in him by being fulfilled in his line, the twig from Jesse his father, the child, the son, the mighty God, the angel of great counsel one. All those things that have no fulfillment in any biblical figure except Jesus of Nazareth, at least in the Christian understanding. So what about Daniel? Right? We can see that in the New Testament, this idea of breaking the nations to pieces like clay vessels is extended from Jesus to others who conquer like he did. This is not just a New Testament concept. It's something rooted in the biblical text, specifically the book of Daniel. Let's take a look at verses 14 through 27. We'll read 13 as well. It says, I kept on beholding in the visions of the night, and see there, with the clouds of the heavens, someone like a son of man happened to be coming. And to the Ancient of Days he gained access, and they brought him up close before that one. And to him there were given rulership and dignity and kingdom, that the peoples, national groups, and languages should all serve even him. Very similar to Psalm 2, right? I have installed my king. You are my son. I will give nations as your inheritance. You will break them to pieces like clay vessels. Here we have someone like a son of man. This is the Jewish texts. Text from Daniel before Jesus was even born, talking about someone like a son of man coming before the Ancient of Days, being given rulership, dignity, and kingdom, just like in David's case. His rulership is an indefinitely lasting rulership that will not pass away, his kingdom one that will not be brought to ruin. What did we read in Isaiah 11? Right after Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 established that the child, the son born to us, Israel, would have a rulership on the throne of David as a mighty God or angel of great counsel, that he'd have the Spirit of Jehovah settle down upon him. He would judge the wicked. He would judge the upright one in righteousness and then put the wicked one to death. And then there would be all this peace, right? Things that haven't happened yet. But before that, he would have a glorious resting place and then be stood up as a signal to the nations. And that would be God's second chance to people, the nations, Israel and Judah. So it would seem, based on the conditions described in Isaiah 11, where it said that the earth would be filled with the knowledge of Jehovah, there'd be no harm nor any ruin in all of his holy mountain, that all these animals and these children would play in peaceful conditions. Right, that seems to be exactly what we're talking about here, because it says that the one who's given this kingdom, this rulership, that in the other text from Isaiah and Psalm 2 is in relation to the throne of David, it's not going to pass away. Right, so if the rulership given to the one on the throne of David is going to establish the whole earth having the knowledge of Jehovah so that there's peace and no more harm or ruin, I don't see how they could be two different kingdoms then. And then it says, as for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within on account of it, and the very visions of my head began to frighten me. I went up close to one of those who were standing, that I might request from him reliable information on all this. One of the angelic beings, either Michael or Gabriel, as I've discussed before in my Michael and Jesus as the Biblical Archangel series, part 4. And he said to me, as he went on to make known to me the very interpretation of the matters, as for these huge beasts, because there are four kings that will stand up from the earth. But the holy ones of the Supreme One will receive the kingdom. That sounds exactly like what Jesus says in Revelation 2, where he says those who conquered will rule with him and dash the nations to pieces. using very similar language to Psalm 2, about how the one like David, or on the throne of David, speaking to David, but not all about David, would do. Here, after saying there is one like that, who is given rulership like that, and whom all people serve like that, and like Isaiah 9 and 11, it says the holy ones of the Supreme One are given the kingdom, and they will take possession of the kingdom for time indefinite, even for time indefinite upon times indefinite. Doesn't sound like it's going to end. Then it was that I desired, this is Daniel again, to make certain concerning the fourth beast, which proved to be different from all the others, extraordinarily fearsome, the teeth of which were of iron, and the claws of which were of copper, which was devouring and crushing, and which was treading down even what was left of its feet. And concerning the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 fell, even that horn that had eyes and a mouth speaking grandiose things, and the appearance of which was bigger than that of its fellows, I kept on beholding, when that very horn made war upon the holy ones, and it was prevailing against them. Very similar to the language of Revelation 12, and how the dragon wages war on the remaining ones of the seed of the woman, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment itself was given in favor of the holy ones of the Supreme One, and the definite time arrived that the holy ones took possession of the kingdom. To the one that conquers, I will grant to sit down with me on my Father's throne, just as I conquered and sat down on my Father's throne. Revelation 3:21, together with Revelation 2, where Jesus said he would give authority over nations to those who conquered, to break them to pieces like clay vessels, exactly as the king in Psalm 2 is described as doing, which we find fulfillment through the things written in Isaiah about the one who would come from Jesse, David's father, on the throne of David. This is what he said. As for the fourth beast, there's a fourth kingdom that will come to be on the earth, that will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour all the earth and trample it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of that kingdom there will be 10 kings that will rise up, and still another one will rise up after them, and he himself will be different from the first ones, and 3 kings he will humiliate. And he will speak even words against the Most High, and he will harass continually the holy ones themselves of the Supreme One, and he will intend to change times and law, and they will be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. And the court itself proceeded to sit, and his own rulership they finally took away, that is of the fourth beast, who's different from all the other kingdoms, and who speaks words against the Most High, and who harasses the holy ones of the Supreme One. Right, just like the dragon that wages war in Revelation 12 and disgorges a river of water after the seed of the woman, but the water is swallowed up by the earth, and then right after that, what happens? The dragon goes down to the sand of the sea, and a beast rises up and wages war with the holy ones. It's the same thing. And the kingdom, right after the court takes its seat and the rulership, they take away from this fourth beast in order to annihilate him and to destroy that fourth beast totally. The kingdom and the rulership and the grandeur of the kingdoms under all the heavens were given to the people who are the holy ones of the Supreme One. Their kingdom is an indefinitely lasting kingdom, and all the rulerships will serve and obey even them or him. Could be either one. And so it depends on how you see the antecedent. But either way, we know for sure we're talking about more than just the Son of Man, are we not? The Son of Man here is first given rulership, dignity, and kingdom, just like Jesus is in the New Testament. And then what does he do? Let's go back to it. Revelation 2. Right? I mean, these things all are either fulfilled in unique ways related to Jesus and all the things that are written about him that uniquely apply to him but not to David, like not seeing the pit, not seeing corruption, having a glorious resting place, being stood up as a signal to all the nations, all of Israel, Judah, the four extremities of the earth, the child born to us, the son born to us, mighty God, angel of great counsel, spirit of Jehovah settling down. That same one who is said not to have seen the pit, not to have seen corruption, said to have been a God, a son of God, an angel of great counsel, voice of the archangel, to whom after he was resurrected, not only the Jews who held these scriptures sacred looked, but all of the nations inquired and have been inquiring. Not all accepting, but inquiring. People ask about Jesus. People know about Jesus. There's something about Jesus that's different from anybody else, anybody through the line of David. He's the one that stood out and said to have been killed, had a resting place, and been resurrected before he saw corruption. We'll talk about it more next week. Psalm 16:10, other texts that pertain uniquely to someone resurrected before they actually decay, their body is corrupted, as is normally the case, as is the case with David. That one is said to promise the very thing the one like a son of man is promised: a kingdom, a rulership, authority over nations. To him that conquers and observes my deeds down to the end, I will give authority over nations. And he will shepherd the people with an iron rod, just like Psalm 2 said the king of David would do. And that David would do, but not in the fullest sense in which David did it. And so just like with Isaiah 9 and 11, things that are said about the twig from Jesse, the root from Jesse, through the line and throne of David, appear to have fulfillment in someone else. But in the case of Daniel, that someone else, the someone like a son of man to whom all those things are given, the very one in the New Testament who is said to have had a resting place that was glorious and that was stood up as a signal so that all the nations and Israel and Judah would look to, that one then promises to give that same rulership to other people, the same as he received from his Father, the Ancient of Days, the one to whom said to David, "You are my son. I today have become your father." In the same way, Jesus says he received that from the Father. And in Revelation 3:21, he goes further and says, "To the one that conquers, I will grant to sit down with me on my throne, even as I conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." All of this fits uniquely with Jesus. You don't have to believe it, right? We understand there's certain things that aren't like ironclad or provable beyond dispute. But how much of this do you think is likely to have been written down this far in advance by people like David, by people like Isaiah, by people like Daniel, and then all have come to be true, or at least written about as true, in an individual like Jesus, while the Jews were being occupied by Rome, during a time when someone like Jesus wasn't looking to deliver them from Rome, but rejected their attempts to make him king so that he would be killed and have a glorious resting place, and then be stood up as a signal to all the nations, and eventually establish the throne of David by sitting on the throne of his father, and fulfilling texts from Daniel where the one like a son of man is giving authority and kingdom and dignity from the Father, who then is said to have given it to others who are also spoken about in texts like Daniel, written before the Messiah was even born. Let's go to another text written before Jesus was born. It's known as 4Q246, the Son of God text. It's an Aramaic text that has some language very similar to biblical texts like Daniel. Which is why I'm bringing it up here, to sort of try to tie some of these ideas and concepts together uniquely in association with Jesus, in addition to what we're already seeing for sure is uniquely associated with Jesus. Whether you believe it really happened or not, someone either came up with an incredible story and was able to create all of this narrative about an individual who is testified by non-Jews and non-Christians as well. I did a video about it. I wrote an article about it. Non-biblical evidence that for the historicity of Jesus. It's not just Jews. It's not just Christians that write about Jesus. So someone like Jesus who exists, if you believe anyone from history existed, I think you have to believe Jesus existed. Because to believe anyone else existed, you're believing in less evidence they existed than the evidence we have that Jesus existed. And so for someone like that who actually existed, who is said to have been put to death, rejected by the Jews, and then to someone whose death, and in our belief resurrection, is something everybody looks to, even if you don't accept him. We all look at it. We're like, should we accept him? What is this? Did this really happen? There's an inquiry. We inquire about him, just like Isaiah 11 said would happen, in association with the rule that would come on the throne of David, that like Psalm 2 and Isaiah 9 and 11 said that ruler would do. He would be given all nations, and all nations would look to him, including Israel, including Judah, including the Jews, during a second chance being given by the God of the Bible, before he puts the wicked one to death, before he judges the lowly one in uprightness, before he brings about conditions where there'll be no more harm or ruin in all of the earth. There is a lot going on in these pre-Christian texts that's then written about in these Christian texts that's incredibly interesting, something you inquire about, if nothing else, just like Isaiah said we would do. 4Q246, the Son of God text, written about 50 to 75 years before Jesus was born. This article here is by Edward M. Cook, Bulletin for Biblical Research number 5, 1995. And we're going to jump down. This is the transcription of the text. Let's go to the translation. So the first part is kind of fragmentary, and it's not really together enough to make application to what we've been talking about. So let's just get to the second column, which is, so this text, written 50 to 75, 100 years before Jesus was even born, before there was ever even anyone known as a Christian, during a time when the Jews believed there would be a twig out of Jesse that would be a son born to us, a child born to us, that therefore wouldn't be Israel, that would be a mighty God, an angel of great counsel, someone on whom the princely rule would fall in the line and throne of David, and that David appears to have written about in association with his kingship as God's son, who would not see the pit, and who would inherit all the nations, and to whom, according to Isaiah 11, all the nations would look inquiringly, and who, according to Daniel 7, that one would be like a son of man, who would be given kingdom and all the nations, rulership of those nations, together with others who are called the holy ones of the Supreme One. This text exists among those people with those beliefs 50 to 100 years before there was ever a Jesus, ever a Christian. This is what it says. He will be called the Son of God, and the Son of the Most High they will call him. Like the meteors that you saw, so will be their kingdom. A few years they will reign over the land, and they will crush everyone or everything. People will crush people. Nation will crush nation, until the people of God shall arise, and all will have rest from the sword. His or their, there's some difference, as I mentioned at the start of the show, with some of the translation of this text. His or their kingdom is an eternal kingdom. But regardless of the his or their part here, right, because it's really in some sense based on the antecedent, Son of God, or their kingdom, we just read in Daniel chapter 7 that the one who would be given the princely rule on the throne of David and who would inherit nations to break to pieces, according to Daniel 7, pre-Christian text, the one like a son of man who's given that kingdom, given that princely rule that would never end, right? Just like in Isaiah 9 and 11, that would bring about conditions where there'd be no more harm or ruin in all of God's holy mountain. That kingdom's also given to the holy ones. So here we have a text that's speaking very similarly about this Son of God, Son of the Most High, just like there would be a son born to us, a son given to us, and so it's not the us, but there's still a them, because there's the holy ones who are given the kingdom that Jesus even speaks about in the New Testament, the ones that conquer with him. So this is all consistent, whether you see this part of 4Q 246 second column as his or their, because they're really both, right? In the biblical tradition of both the Old Testament and the New, it's both. There's a Messiah, there's an anointed one, there's a king, there's a son, there's a child, there's a mighty God, an angel of great counsel, and there's the holy ones. There's the ones who conquer. There's the Daniel chapter 7 ones, and there's the Revelation 2 and Revelation 3 ones. There's no contradiction. There's consistency. Just like in this text. Their kingdom is an eternal kingdom, and all his or their ways are in truth. He or they shall judge the land in truth, and all will make peace. Right? Just like we read in Isaiah 11. He'll judge the lowly one in uprightness. They shall judge the land in truth. All will make peace. What did it say about the cow, the lion, the lamb, the child, the cobra? There will be no more harm, no more ruin in all my holy mountain. All will make peace. The sword will cease from the land, and all the nations shall do homage to him or their. The great God is his or their help. I think this should be there in the sense of, the pronoun, not the demonstrative. Either way, all the nations shall do him or them homage. We saw that in Daniel 7. Right? The peoples, national groups, and languages will all serve even him, or potentially them in verse 27, because it's them who's being talked about, in addition to him. Just like right here. But it distinguishes the great God from his or their, or him and them, just like the Ancient of Days is distinguished from the one like a son of man and the holy ones of the Supreme One. It's all consistent, just like Jesus distinguishes himself and those who conquer like him from the Father. The one who gives them the authority, just like the Ancient of Days gave the Son of Man and the Holy One's authority, just like God gave David authority, Psalm 2, just like it says the one who is the child born to us is given the princely rule, the Spirit of Jehovah settles down, and he would have enjoyment in the fear of Jehovah. The great God is his or their help. He's the one responsible for all of this. He's the one on whose throne Jesus says he sits and allows those ruling with him to sit, which is why after they accomplish everything they're to accomplish on that throne, the Son gives the kingdom back to him. 1 Corinthians 15. All of it is consistent. All of it makes sense. From all these pre-Christian texts, Psalm 2, Isaiah 9, Isaiah 11, Daniel 7, 4Q2:46. He himself will fight for him or them. He will put the nations in his or their power. What did Psalm 2 say? Ask of me, that I may give nations as your inheritance. What did Jesus say? To the one that conquers, I will grant authority over nations, to dash them to pieces, the same as I received from my Father. Ha! It says it right here, 50 to 100 years before Jesus even existed, in a human sense. The great God will put the nations in his or their power, just like in Daniel 7, just like in Psalm 2, just like in Revelation 2 and 3. And all of them he will place before him, them. They all come before him. It's the Father, to whose glory is Jesus made Lord, so that all knees in heaven and on earth and all tongues confess him as Lord, to whose glory is all that done. Philippians 2, 9 through 11. It's the one God, the Father. It's always the Father, even if he allows glory to go to the Son and to the holy ones that rule together with him on the Father's throne. All of them he will place before him, them. The nations in this case, he's placing the nations, right? Because the nations are the inheritance of the one like a son of man, the holy ones, even to David in Psalm 2. But doesn't appear to all be about David, but the one who's on the throne of David, according to Isaiah 9 and 11. His dominion is an eternal dominion, and all the deeps of the earth are his. So very similar, is it not, again, to what we see described in Daniel 7, a pre-Christian text that's writing about things that are fulfilled after Jesus comes to the earth. So we don't use it to prove he's the biblical Messiah yet, right? We have to wait until those things happen. But Jesus talks about those things happening in the New Testament. So he's not contradicting any of this stuff. He's not contradicting anything that's spoken of in Psalm 2, anything that's spoken of in Daniel 7 about the Son of Man, the holy ones of the Supreme One, or 4Q2:46. Everything that's written about Jesus in terms of what he did, the things that are said to have been fulfilled in him, is all consistent with these pre-Christian texts, both in the Bible and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q2:46. And then he talks about how the rest of it, the parts like from Isaiah 11, the parts where he would put the wicked one to death and then there'd be no more harm or ruin in all of God's holy mountain. There'd be all this peace, right? Just like it says right here, all will make peace. after he judges the land in truth. Righteousness are the belt of his loins. Those things Jesus speaks about as coming true in relation to him and his followers, the holy ones, as they rule over that kingdom. Promised to David, spoken about as being fulfilled in the child through the line of David and on his throne, who would have a glorious resting place and to whom all the nations would look to inquiringly, including Israel and Judah, and who would be called the Son of God, the Son of the Most High, they will call him. We have fulfillment in that in the New Testament as well. Let's go to Luke for our final text. Luke chapter 2, verses 30 through 35. Speaking of the Son who is born to us, the Son or child that is given to us, who would be a mighty God, an angel of great counsel. In Luke 1, 30 through 35, we read this. So the angel said to her, "Have no fear, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And look, you will conceive in your womb and give birth to a son, a child. And you are to call his name Jesus. This one will be great and will be called Son of the Most High." Let's go back to the text. This earlier part we didn't read, that's kind of fragmentary in column 1. Look at the last part. And all will serve him. Likewise, his son will be called the Great. Now back to Luke 21. This one will be great and will be called Son of the Most High. His son will be called the Great, Son of the Most High, Son of God. And Jehovah God will give him the throne of David his father. And he will rule as king over the house of Jacob forever, and there will be no end of his kingdom. But Mary said to the angel, "How is this to be, since I'm having no intercourse with a man?" In answer, the angel said to her, "Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. For that reason also what is born will be called holy, God's Son." All three of those terms, great, Son of the Most High, God's Son, are referenced in 4Q246. At the end of column 1, the Great. The start of column 2, Son of God, Son of the Most High. And then everything else fits as well, both with the fulfillment that is described in Luke, in Acts 13, in Revelation 2 and 3, and what is spoken of and prophesied before Jesus existed in Daniel 7, their kingdom. Their kingdom will be an eternal kingdom. They shall judge the land in truth, and all will make peace. All the nations shall do homage to him or them. The great God is his or their help, and he will put the nations in his or their power. Just like God prophesied to David directly, not to the house of Israel, but to me. Let me refer to the decree of Jehovah. He has said to me. You are my son, I today have become your father. Ask that I may give nations as your inheritance and the ends of the earth as your own possession. You'll break them with an iron scepter. Just like it says right here, I will give nations as your inheritance and the ends of the earth as your possession. All the nations will do him homage. Great God is their help. He will fight for them. He will put the nations in his or their power. His dominion is an eternal dominion. Just like we read not only in the Psalms here with respect to David and the one who would come in his line according to Isaiah 9, 6, and 7, but also in Daniel chapter 7, another Aramaic text, just like 4Q246, that speaks explicitly of one like a son of man, given this rulership and kingdom that will not be brought to ruin, and the holy ones of the Supreme One receiving that same kingdom and having possession of that kingdom to time indefinite, even times indefinite upon times indefinite. And the rulership and the grandeur of the kingdom under all the heavens were given to the people who are the holy ones of the Supreme One. So we have these texts, my friends, written before Jesus was born, before there was ever even a Christian, spoken directly to David, but about things that weren't completely fulfilled in David, such as all the nations being given as his inheritance. And then also a little bit later, as we'll talk more about next week, him not staying in Sheol or seeing corruption in the pit. But that are spoken about by others in the nation of Israel as being fulfilled through the line of David, on the throne of David, by one who would have the Spirit of Jehovah, who would have a glorious resting place and be stood up as a signal to all the nations and to Israel and to Judah. And the nations would look to inquiringly, and who would rule in righteousness, put the wicked one to death, and bring a condition to the earth where there would be no harm or any ruin, and where the earth would be filled with the knowledge of the biblical God. That is very similar to what we read in another pre-Christian text in Daniel as having fulfillment in one like a son of man, who's given a kingdom that will never be brought to ruin, and which kingdom is given to others that will never be brought to ruin, which is consistent with what we read in another Aramaic text like Daniel, written 50 to 100 years before Jesus was even born, that speaks about things very similar to Daniel and to Isaiah and to the Psalms by David and by Jesus in the book of Revelation, where he talks about being given authority over a kingdom and then giving that authority to others to rule with him on his Father's throne in that kingdom.